So the ways you can go about making a data set is you can make pre-made data sets. There are pre-made data sets out there. I've shown a couple of them in this class. You could use them yourself. Any number of things. And you could always like cobble together your own versions. And we'll talk a little bit about that, how you could do that. So maybe you download a couple there are a lot of pre-made data sets, and some of them might be like of similar variety. Like so you might have a bunch of face data sets. You want to cobble those together. The last thing is you can scrape the internet. I'll show a couple of examples of those sort of things. And the very last one is make your own. In case that wasn't clear, you're moving from like using someone else's data set, which again, like I feel like data sets are the most creative part. So using someone else's is kind of removing all the creativity from it. Cobbling pieces together, getting cool. Scraping the internet is definitely like a cool thing and something that I don't think a lot of people have really explored yet. And then obviously making your own. That seems really, really cool. I would love to see more people doing that. But of course, the inverse is that like you're going from easy to really, really hard. So you've got to balance those two out, especially in a class of this length of time. So what I would say is Google is your friend in these cases. So if you want a data set of shoes, you can always type in shoes data set and it will almost always return a result. Whether or not it meets the criteria you want is a different story, but it is possible.
We have a question from Anastasia.
Yeah, go for it.
Should I read it?
Yeah, go for it. Sorry.
Yeah. Anastasia asks, a big data set above 1K is only important if you want to produce realistic imagery. Are there data set method strategies that would produce results other than what the model is designed for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that even at 1K, depending on how diverse the data set is, you might not get realistic samples. So remember, like that StyleGAN model is trained on 65,000 photos of faces. And that's how it gets super realistic. The lower the number you go, the less like you are to get realistic images. But also like realism is kind of it's a little bit of a distant, it's hard to describe what is actually realistic. So in general, I would say like there's also ways that you could combine multiple data sets and get different results. A lot of this is just stuff you have to explore by trying it and see what works, right? So like if I were to mash up a face data set with my floral data set, like the mix of those two might not look very good. But if I were to say mix, let's say cartoons, so like actually I've seen a data set that is half anime faces and half realistic photo faces. And those two actually do work pretty well together. So it's just kind of about finding how things work. And then I have seen some work where people are training stuff on very small data sets. And I will say StyleGAN struggles a little bit, but sometimes it does produce interesting abstract results with smaller data sets. Again, some of this comes down to how willing am I to experiment with this and how much money am I willing to lose if it's not a good data, if it doesn't produce a good result. So it's kind of up to you. You should sort of think about how you want to approach it. Just gonna look here. So Juliet said, any advice on using something that isn't an object? So Juliet, could you explain a little bit more, like landscapes, cityscapes, or nature scenes?
Yeah, like just generally things that don't have an edge, you know, or not an object that's sitting in the middle of a more defined field.
So there is like a landscape data set that's in Runway already that you could just play with and see what you like. In general, I find that those things do work pretty well. It just, again, it's like how diverse of a data set is it, right? Like, is it showing both? Sorry, go ahead.
To ask the question in a better way, like, how much is it relying on being able to get edges of things, and how much is it just generally picking up colors and things? Like, one of the things that I show in class to talk about perception is butterflies against a sort of mixed up background. Mm-hmm. Like, is using images like that potentially not great in this situation just because the computer can't pick out the edges?
So there's some edge detection in the way StyleGAN works, but edges aren't the only thing that matter to it. Colors do matter, textures matter. So I would say, like, if you have a big enough data set of like that actually would be a very interesting thing of like butterflies on a certain background, like almost camouflage. It would almost be interesting to see how a style GAN model does interpret those. Part of what I'll say is like this class is very experimental because like most of you have different interests and specialties than the data science community is, and no one has tried these things before. So we like literally might not know. So like you might be breaking new ground by trying things and finding new ways to find stuff. So some of the answer is just like, we have to find out and we'll see how it goes. I'm gonna quickly move through a little bit more of this just because I wanna quickly show some basically like a walkthrough of how I would create a data set. But I see that Julie is putting in some really interesting comments in the chat. So if you like, hopefully those will get moved over to Slack, or like I will make note of moving them into Slack in case we run out of time in class. But Julie's also listed like some interesting links to other data set findings. So also that's great timing because like so this is a link, a professor by the name of Golan Levin, who is very interested in data and images and works at Carnegie Mellon, has put together a like publicly, a list of public image data sets that people are sort of like working on together. It's a Google sheet, so you can go through it. There's a lot of image data sets in there. Some of them I would say are gonna be very hard to pull down, but you can maybe like go through it and figure it out yourself, or like kind of figure out a process to get those images down. Some of them will be really small and they won't really work for StyleGAN in the way you want them to, or some of them will be like a little weird and you'll have to do some manipulation to them in Photoshop. But there's a list of places, like you start with this list and find some pretty interesting data sets that no one's really worked off of yet. So the way you do this is like, what I might recommend is like, try to find a data set on Google or on Instagram or on Flickr that might be interesting to work with. The problem with some of these is that it will take some time to clean up, which I will go through next, is like, what's the process of cleaning up one of these data sets? But you can usually find a lot of images that are all pretty similar, like, you know, in using one of these tools. So like you could say like, just find all of the, let's say all of the nebulas that are on Google. But what you might actually want to do is say, find all the nebulas on Google, find all the nebulas on Instagram, and find all the nebulas on Flickr, and like combine that into one data set. Because the thing is like, this probably isn't news to anyone, but like Flickr has kind of like it's kind of become a historical database rather than as a new thing where people upload photos to. Whereas Instagram is like the thing where people are uploading stuff to right now. And Google is like scraping the internet for like all time. But Google, like, I don't think really scrapes Instagram. So like you can get a different mix of images through these different data sets. And that might be the best approach, is to like try to find different things from different places. And then lastly, obviously there's the Scott Eaton world, which is like creating your own images, creating your own data sets. It's very time consuming. But if you have access or like have built up a library of those things, it might be really cool to work with. Lastly, like the most common thing that happens to me is I end up doing a mix of everything. I'll scrape some stuff from Instagram. I'll say like, oh, I only have 500 images. I'll jump on Flickr, scrape some of that stuff, pull it in, like these sort of things. These are some of the scraper tools that I know work really well. I already have a demo video of Instagram Scraper. I already have a demo of the image downloader tool for Chrome. And I'm gonna probably this week or next week, like do a Flickr Scraper demo as well as a Google image downloader. If you're interested in either one of these, let me know. And I can like try to do one of them this week so that it's available to people. But these are links to repos. So if you know how to use Git and you know how to use Python, you'll be able to use these pretty easily. But like I said, if you're interested in any of these data set tools and you just need a little bit of help, let me know and I can definitely jump in and help with those things. Instagram Scraper is like kind of the one that I like to show off because most people don't even realize that their Instagrams could be scraped, but it's pretty interesting. You can install this pretty easily. I would generally recommend you install this on your Paperspace machine, in part because if you've never installed software on your Mac or your Windows before, you might run into a bunch of errors just trying to install pip. If you do decide that you want to install this on your desktop, like let me know, or start trying with this line. And if it doesn't work, we can sort of like try to figure out how to actually install it on your machine. But in general, if you install this stuff on Paperspace, it will usually work, but it will be a little bit expensive because you're going to be running your server while doing this work. So just something to keep in mind. So usually the way this works is you scrape a bunch of images off the internet, and then you find out you've got like 3,000 photos. That's great. And then you realize like, oh wait, but I want to do a StyleGAM model, and they all need to be square, and they all need to be 1024 by 1024. How do I do that? And like, you know, most of us are graphic designers, we just say like, oh, I could just open it in Photoshop and like crop all them. But like to do that for 3,000 photos would probably take us all a very long time. And yes, there are scripts that we could write to like do that in Photoshop. That also might like take a little bit of time to write that script or to make that action and then do some other things. Like in general, like this is just a scale problem. And this is another thing that we hear about, like big data is a scale problem. And this is going to become a scale problem at like an artist level. So I've started building a set of tools called Dataset Tools. And I'll quickly walk us through like a demo of how I would use this. But it's basically another Python tool set that allows you to work with images at scale. And it just is a really quick script to do certain things that I generally will do pretty often with my data sets. So you can install this and you can use it, and like we can talk about how you might use it. It's a pretty straightforward way to, I've got it documented, I've got some videos on it. I will gladly help anyone who wants to use it. And we can walk through how it works.